Whether we like it or not, many people believe that the moment these notes were first heard on MTV, it was as if a meteorite fell on Earth. And this meteorite did not wipe out the dinosaurs, but heavy metal. All of heavy metal. The mastermind behind the dropping of this meteorite was not the good Lord, but a series of musicians from the city of Seattle in the United States. Musicians who were members of bands belonging to a genre that must have received the most curses than anything else by heavy metal fans around the globe. Grunge. In this video, we are going to examine if things really happened that way. And let me say something before I start. Apart from some albums by Alice in Chains and Soundgarden, I don't actually like grunge. But that's one thing. That has nothing to do with what really happened back then. I don't think it's right to blame musicians and bands for things with which, as we will see, didn't have much to do. Also, as metal fans, regardless of how each of us relates to the scene, we should learn from the mistakes of the past so that we do not repeat them in the future. The odd thing about grunge is that it never actually constituted a clearly defined musical genre. It was nothing more than a marketing gimmick by the owners of the sub-pop label from Seattle, in order to link together under an umbrella term all the bands they had on their roster. The general idea is that grunge is a combination of old metal from the early 70s, Black Sabbath, Budgie, Buffalo, hardcore punk, mostly Black Flag, and noise rock, Flipper, Big Black, Melvins. The proportions of these three elements, however, are completely random depending on the band. The main common characteristics, at least in the beginning, were the lo-fi productions, the heavy distortion on the guitars, and the overall lack of technicality, along with some other external identifiers, such as the lyrics and the clothing. Plus, of course, the fact that almost everyone came from Seattle. But if you sit down and listen, for example, to Tad's God's Balls and Pearl Jam's 10, it's like listening to two completely different music genres. In general, the first work that can be characterized as grunge is the EP Come On Down by Green River from 1985, and the major names of the genre are, of course, the holy quartet of Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Nirvana, and Pearl Jam, plus Mudhoney, Screaming Trees, Tad, Mother Love Bone, Stone Temple Pilots, L7, Hole, Babes in Toyland, and Skinyard. Of course, I reiterate that the purely musical affinity among all of these was minimal. Objectively, there was not much of a connection between the Zeppelin-esque glam hard rock of Mother Love Bone, the dark psychedelic metal of Alice in Chains, the garage punk of Mudhoney, and the almost sludge metal before sludge metal of Tad, just taking four names at random. The rise of grunge began in 1990 and peaked in 91–92 through means and processes that will be analyzed later. As for its decline, I believe it had already begun in 1995 and was complete in a very short period, not even a year, as a result of three main factors. Firstly, of course, the completely vague and weak musical connection of the bands. Secondly, the tragedies that had befallen some greats of the genre, with the suicide of Kurt Cobain and the deep drug addiction of Lane Staley. And finally, the paradox of having a musical genre that had started as alternative, revolutionary, and groundbreaking become a global phenomenon, filling stadiums, selling and earning millions. And you tell me, dude, that this was what brought metal down? Although the prevailing view is that the rise of grunge dismantled heavy metal in all its forms and across the globe, this is, of course, not exactly true. To put it simply, Grunge became the most popular form of heavy rock, predominantly in the USA and the UK, while at the same time, the overall impact on pop culture of the most popular forms of heavy metal shrank to a minimum, again, mostly in these two countries. The forms of heavy metal were glam or hair metal, thrash metal, and classic traditional heavy metal. Obviously, as these countries are the most important in the rock universe, these three metal genres basically disappeared, which of course prompted the music specialists to declare heavy metal officially dead throughout the 90s. But let's examine for a moment this last suggestion. In territories like Germany, the Scandinavian countries, the former Eastern Europe, Japan, Argentina, Brazil, or Mexico, things didn't go like in the US and the UK. Heavy metal kept on being relevant. But as the three main genres were missing in action, new ones filled the void. As a result, for many new metal subgenres, the 90s were their golden age. Progressive metal, power metal, gothic metal, stoner rock/metal, and of course, extreme metal in all its forms, became popular, produced excellent albums, and established themselves in the consciousness of the average metalhead as respectable alternatives to what they listened to and loved in the 80s. Not to mention, of course, groove metal and nu metal, genres that may have been met with intense skepticism, even ridicule, by the then-existing metal community, but never ceased to have the metal component as part of their name and identity, as well as huge success in record sales, MTV airplay, and concert attendances. And all of this happened in the 90s, when it was supposedly the crossing of the desert for heavy metal. So, if we are talking about what specifically might have been influenced by grunge, we are talking about mainly the US and the UK, and only glam metal, thrash metal, and classic, traditional, heavy metal. Of course, the way journalists usually see things, the connection was immediate, and since the rapid rise of the one coincided with the sharp decline of the others, the two phenomena must be linked. But again, is this true? Was actually grunge the reason these three genres were brought down? Let's find out. For me, the golden age, the peak of glam metal, was the 3-year period from 1986 to 1988. By 1989, audience fatigue was already beginning to show, as the formula applied by many glam metal bands had started becoming evident, alienating a lot of metal fans. An album that, in my opinion, played a huge role in making people change their attitude towards glam metal was Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses, which, although released in 1987, achieved worldwide success in 1988. This album was glam metal in name only. In reality, it was an album that truly came from the streets. Straightforward, raw, much heavier than anything else in the genre, and with a distinctly punk aesthetic that made it stand out like a sore thumb in the Los Angeles scene of the day. When people listened to it, everything else seemed simple, silly, and phony. How could someone who loved Paradise City and Rocket Queen go back to Poison and Bon Jovi? The GNR effect was felt even in glam metal itself. If someone listens carefully, a lot of the bands of the scene that came into prominence in 1989 or 90, Skid Row, LA Guns, Dangerous Toys, Shotgun Messiah, Sea Hags, Junkyard, River Dogs, were heavier and grittier than what came before them, so much so that the term sleaze rock was coined, especially for them. But things started to change in other unexpected ways. On July 14, 1988, the single Cult of Personality was released by the all-African-American band Living Colour. A few weeks later, it entered the Billboard Singles Top 20, while the band's first album, Vivid, went on to sell 2 million copies in America. This song was one of the first examples of the so-called alternative or funk metal. Soon, the music press of the time began to timidly report on some strange bands that dressed eccentrically and played something like metal that wasn't exactly metal. In 1990, 3 of these names made a big splash. Faith No More, from San Francisco, saw their single Epic, basically a rap metal song, enter the Billboard Singles Top 10. Jane's Addiction, from Los Angeles, released their second album and alternative metal classic Ritual de lo Habitual, which certified double platinum in the US alone. And the, much heavier at the time, Red Hot Chili Peppers saw their cover of Stevie Wonder's Higher Ground in regular rotation on MTV, and their 1989 album Mother's Milk go gold. 1990 was of course also the year the world discovered Seattle. In July, Mother Love Bone released the album Apple, and could have become the saviors of heavy rock if their lead singer hadn't tragically died 2 months earlier. A month later, Alice in Chains, a former glam metal band, released Facelift, and a few months later embarked on the Clash of the Titans tour, supporting Slayer, Megadeth, and Anthrax. As the year was heading to a close, the alternative, funk rap metal virus had firmly entered the rock press of the time, with various new and hot names being continuously talked about by journalists. Some of them actually got huge worldwide record deals and participated in big tours. Names like Helmet, Primus, Warrior Soul, Fishbone, Galactic Cowboys, Mindfunk, Scatterbrain, Mordred, 24/7, Spies, etc. Soon, even glam metal had its own version of strange bands like Love Hate or Saigon Kick. I say all this to emphasize on 2 things. The first is, and that's the way I remember it at the time, these bands were considered a breath of fresh air in the whole universe of heavy metal. We never considered them enemies of metal, but an extension of metal. It was clear to everyone that the genre these bands were going to replace was glam metal, and regardless of what we might say and listen to now, we never had any problem with that. Any time of day we would take Soundgarden, Warrior Soul, and Faith No More over Poison, Bon Jovi, and Motley Crue. The second thing is that the fall of glam metal did not happen overnight the day Nirvana released Smells Like Teen Spirit. It had started and was slowly progressing for at least 2 years before that. And to be honest, the moral perpetrators of this fall were the artists, managers, and record labels, with their conscious choice to polish and simplify their sound. They had brought it one step away from pure pop, relying on external songwriters, video clips, and ballads. At the same time, their excesses and extravagances had long since crossed the boundaries of the typical rock and roll lifestyle and entered the realm of the ridiculous or just plain sad. All of this paved the way for the grunge and alternative bands, who at least in the beginning were considered something fresher, more genuine, and less formulaic. Nirvana and Smells Like Teen Spirit were simply the pinnacle moment and expression of that fact. If it weren't for them, it would have been someone else. The course was predetermined. With thrash, things are simpler. In the late 80s and early 90s, thrash was living its golden age, perhaps not creatively, but definitely in terms of sales and recognition. The Big Four were now huge names in the entire metal scene, with albums that easily went gold and platinum in the United States, while even the second tier in many quotes, bands of the scene, like Testament, Sepultura, Creator, or Overkill, sold well, went on world tours and headlined major festivals. In the first half of 1991, thrash experienced its peak commercial moment with the Clash of the Titans tour, which included 3/4 of the Big Four, except for Metallica, of course, performing nearly 50 concerts in the US, filling large arenas or small stadiums. This was incredible considering the heaviness of the music being played, and the fact that 5 to 6 years earlier these bands were playing small clubs, being considered noise by the serious music press. This tour ended in July 1991, and immediately after, a series of events occurred that drastically changed the impact of the scene on the global rock market and led to its sharp decline. Grunge had little to do with any of these events. First of all, in August 1991, Metallica released the Black Album, an album that, no matter what opinion you have of it, I think we can all agree on one thing: it was by no means thrash. Secondly, the album immediately achieves massive success. We are talking about a level unknown not only to thrash, but to heavy metal in general, with sales immediately reaching millions, music videos being played constantly on MTV, concerts in front of 1.5 million people in Moscow, appearances at award ceremonies, etc. Thirdly, a few months later, the next blow comes. One of the most well-known names of the second tier of thrash, Pantera from Texas, released Vulgar Display of Power in February 1992. The album receives rave reviews, immediately achieves massive success, propelling the band to the forefront of the heavy metal universe. But again, although it is heavy and aggressive, one cannot claim that it particularly aligns with the classic thrash sound. It's close to it, but it's also different from it. As a result of the success of these two releases, something strange is happening with most of the major bands of the thrash scene. As if they are in cahoots, in their subsequent albums, they attempt to imitate either Metallica or Pantera, or both. They slow down the tempos, become much simpler, infuse their sound with a lot of classic heavy metal and perhaps a bit of alternative in some cases, while consciously trying to become catchier. To further understand what I'm talking about, remember these 12 albums from classic thrash bands, all released between March 1992 and September 1993.
So alone, away it goes, the life that you have wasted. To ride the horse another day, yeah. The only thing I ever made in my life was a fist. The only thing that ever proved. Don't you see what I mean? It's all it is, pretend me. You won't be mine. Laughing like the true valley.
Some of these albums were very successful, others, no. Some of these albums, or even all of them, you might consider, and they might be masterpieces. Some not. However, I believe we can all agree on one thing again. The percentage of regular, orthodox thrash present in these albums is minimal to non-existent. Everyone wanted to become the new Metallica or the new Pantera. Why, you might ask? What can I say? I don't know. Did the record labels impose it on them? Maybe the musicians themselves saw it as an opportunity to expand their audience and achieve even greater success. Or maybe the band simply grew older and evolved. The choice of reason is yours. One thing is certain. The real, straightforward, pure thrash suddenly became an endangered species in 1992. Only Sodom, Tankard, and DRI kept the flag flying high. But it wasn't enough. The Great Slayer tried to save face in 1994 with divine intervention, but it was already too late. As you can see, the word grunge was barely connected with the previous narrative. Perhaps the general atmosphere of alternative metal inspired some musicians, such as Anthrax or Suicidal Tendencies. But beyond that, nothing more. And for me, it is clear that the people who craved aggressive and violent music did not turn to grunge, but to extreme metal. It is not a coincidence that during that time, death metal was generating so many great albums, while black metal was making its big entrance into the global music scene, and the first superclassics of the genre were being released. And it is indeed puzzling that future journalists and historians, while they immediately linked the decline of thrash with the rise of grunge, did not do the same with the rise of extreme metal. which would have made much more sense.
Tonight we go to see the heavy metal rockstars.
The truth is that in 1991, classic heavy metal was fragmented and particularly weakened. The glory days of the first half of the 80s were a distant memory. Thrash on one hand and glam metal on the other had taken the biggest share of its former popularity. I remind you, by way of example, what was happening back then with some of the giants of the genre. Black Sabbath had recently released 2 albums, Headless Cross and Tear, which, although excellent, had flopped. Dio continued to make good albums, but they sold much less than his earlier ones. Motorhead had released 1916, which, although I consider a very good album, didn't sell anywhere near as much as their classic era works. Kiss, Van Halen, Scorpions, Dokken, and Y&T, who someone could have classified as classic metal in the early 80s, were now clearly in the glam metal camp. Accept had made a rather awkward attempt to join the same camp, giving us one of the weakest albums of their career. Saxon, after a series of mediocre albums, had a slight resurgence in quality with Solid Ball of Rock, which however sold even worse than these albums. Wasp gave us the very good Headless Children, which sold decently, and the even better The Crimson Idol, which however flopped. So what was left for us? Ozzy, who released the most commercially successful album of his career, No More Tears, in 1991, Iron Maiden, immune to any form of stylistic change, and Judas Priest, who gave us the amazing Painkiller, which, although an undisputed artistic triumph, didn't sell as much as its predecessors. These last 2 bands, as you may know, faced some rather dark days during the 90s. But I believe that it was the departure of their 2 incredibly iconic frontmen, and not grunge, that led to them. Now, it is likely that the alternative spirit of the era had some effect on Dickinson and Halford's decisions to leave, but that's about it. Anyway, I think that the situation was already particularly difficult for most of the big names in classic heavy metal, long before grunge made its entrance onto the scene. Here I want to say that all of you who experienced things as metal fans like I did back then may have a different opinion on how successful all those albums I mentioned were. The truth, however, is that back then, success was clearly measured by how much a record sold and how many tickets a tour sold, mainly in America and maybe in the UK. Nothing else mattered. If we now turn to the newest, at the time, big names of the classic heavy metal scene, we had Helloween, whose 2 keeper albums had brought them one step away from global recognition, making the biggest mistake of their career at the beginning of '91 with the release of Pink Bubbles Go Ape. Queensryche had the biggest success of their career, but with an album that was objectively much less traditionally metal compared to their previous ones. Savatage, who had changed their style from pure power metal to a kind of epic rock opera, didn't have the breakthrough they expected. King Diamond was still releasing excellent albums almost every year, but after them of 1988 had ceased to be a commercial force in America. Crimson Glory did not live up to the hopes the metal community had for them when they released the rather disappointing at the time Strange and Beautiful in June 1991. Finally, Metal Church, who were about to make a big splash with a renewed image and sound in the album Human Factor, unfortunately did not succeed in any of their goals. So, again in this regard, things were not particularly promising without grunge having any significant influence in what was happening, except perhaps in the case of Metal Church. I would therefore say that the decline of metal was much more a result of wrong choices, unusual circumstances, significant events, decisions that did not yield the expected results, and not some songs or albums from a few bands in the northwestern corner of the United States. Also, it's inevitable in music, and it has happened repeatedly with many genres and many bands, that whatever achieves immense success, at some point is destined to experience the corresponding decline. It happened with prog rock. It happened with punk that replaced prog. It happened with synth pop and new wave, which replaced punk. In the end, it also happened with heavy metal, which had replaced synth pop and new wave. It would happen in the future with grunge itself and then with new metal, and so on and so forth. Perhaps the only way not to fall is not to rise so high,